On an August afternoon in 1986, a 14-year-old boy vanished from a crowded county fair in southern Oregon. 3 hours later, his 10-year-old sister stood beneath the Ferris wheel where they had agreed to meet, watching it turn again and again while he never arrived. What happened in those missing hours would fracture a family and leave a mystery that has never been resolved. August pressed down on southern Oregon with a dry, steady heat that made the air feel thin by early afternoon. Myrtle Point moved at its usual pace, slow, familiar, predictable. Storefronts stayed open with their doors propped wide. Pickup trucks rolled past without hurry. When the Coos County Fair came to town, it didn't feel dangerous or chaotic. It felt like a break from routine, something everyone had been expecting. Jeremy Bright had been looking forward to it. He was 14, already taller than most kids his age, his long stride forcing Stay to take 2 steps for every one of his. His black Nike shoes, size 13, too big for someone still halfway between childhood and adulthood, scuffed lightly against the pavement as they walked. The red laces were knotted tight, the ends frayed from being tugged loose and tied again. He moved with the restless confidence of someone who didn't think much about limits, physical or otherwise. Jeremy had been born in Baltimore, but Myrtle Point was where people still recognized him without needing an explanation. Even after the move to Grants Pass, the town remained threaded through his life relatives, old routines, places that felt fixed in place. He carried a heart murmur doctors had pointed out years earlier, something adults remembered even when he didn't. To Jeremy, it was background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator you stopped noticing after a while. On Wednesday, August 13th, he went to the fair with his friend Johnny Fish. The grounds were already alive by late morning. Music spilled out of speakers mounted on poles. The air smelled of hot oil, dust, and sugar. Jeremy drifted easily through it all, stopping here, moving on there. His attention pulled in a dozen directions at once. At one point, he peeled away from the crowd and stepped into a payphone booth. The metal door scraped as he pulled it shut, trapping the heat inside. He dropped coins into the slot, pressed the numbers from memory, and waited as the line rang. When his mother answered, his voice came quick and casual. "Hey, Mom, I'm at the fair," Jeremy said, shifting the receiver from one ear to the other as sweat slid down his neck. Diane listened, smiling even though he couldn't see it. "You having fun?" "Yeah. It's busy today," he said. "Listen, you can pick us up Friday, right? Me and Stay." There was a pause, the soft crackle of the line. "Friday works," she said. "I'll be there." "Okay, cool," Jeremy replied. "We'll be ready." They didn't argue. They didn't negotiate. They made a plan, clear and uncomplicated, the kind that felt solid simply because it had been spoken out loud. When he hung up, Jeremy stepped back into the noise of the fair, the phone booth door swinging shut behind him. Later that afternoon, he stopped at his grandmother's tavern, where his stepfather was spending the day. The place was dimmer than outside, the air cooler but heavy with the smell of beer soaked into old wood. Jeremy leaned against the bar, the way he'd done 100 times before. "Can I get some money for tomorrow?" he asked, glancing up at his stepfather. "What for?" "The fair," Jeremy said, already smiling, already expecting the answer. His stepfather reached into his pocket and handed him the cash without hesitation. "Don't lose it." "8." Jeremy folded the bills carefully and slid them into his pocket. "I won't." It wasn't a promise weighed down with meaning. It was just something people said. The next morning came bright and warm. Jeremy dressed without rushing, pulling on a red tank top and blue nylon shorts, the fabric whispering softly as he moved. He slipped into his black windbreaker jacket despite the heat, zipped it part way, and laced his shoes. Stay watched him from the doorway, her hands wrapped around the straps of her bag. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. "We're going together, right?" "Yeah," Jeremy said. "Don't worry." They walked through the gates of the fair side by side, swallowed immediately by sound and motion. The Ferris wheel rose above everything else, its metal frame flashing in the sunlight as it turned, slow and steady, visible from almost anywhere on the grounds. Jeremy pointed it out without thinking. "If we get split up," he said, "we meet there. 5 o'clock. Stay repeated it back to him, careful and exact. 5. By the Ferris wheel. "Good," he said, already scanning the crowd. Around 2 in the afternoon, They stopped near a row of game booths. Jeremy shifted his weight, restless again, the way he always got when he stayed in one place too long. "I'm gonna walk around for a bit," he said. "You go do your thing." "You'll be there at 5? Stay asked, her voice small but steady. "I said 5, Jeremy replied, flashing a quick grin. "I'll be there." He turned and disappeared into the crowd, the black of his jacket visible for a moment before it blended into the mass of moving bodies. The fair kept going. Music thumped. Rides rattled. People laughed, argued, drifted past one another without paying much attention. Somewhere near the Ferris wheel between 1 and 1:30, some would later say they saw Jeremy with a man, that the way he was led away didn't look right. At the time, it didn't stop anything. The wheel kept turning. By 5 o'clock, the sun had dropped just enough to take the edge off the heat. Stay walked to the Ferris wheel and stood where Jeremy had told her to wait. She scanned the crowd, then scanned it again. "He's probably just late," she told herself quietly, her eyes following each passing face. Minutes slipped by. Then more. Jeremy didn't come, and as the Ferris wheel creaked overhead, rising and falling in its endless loop, the space beside Stay remained empty. After leaving Stay near the game booths, Jeremy walked toward the center of the fairgrounds, where the noise thickened and the crowd pressed closer together. Music blasted from mounted speakers. Metal clanged and rattled as rides lifted and dropped their passengers. The air smelled of fried dough, gasoline, and dust kicked up by hundreds of feet. Each step sent a faint grit scraping against the soles of his shoes. Jeremy slowed near the Ferris wheel, close enough to feel the vibration of its movement through the ground. He tugged at the collar of his black windbreaker, his brow tightening against the heat, and scanned the area as if deciding where to go next. He wasn't running. He wasn't lost. He looked like a teenager killing time. Between 1 o'clock and 1:30, a man approached him. No one could later describe the man's face with certainty, only how close he stood, close enough to invade space, close enough that Jeremy leaned back slightly without realizing it. The man spoke first, his voice low, almost lost beneath the music. Jeremy shook his head. "No," he said, short and firm. The man stayed where he was. Another witness would later remember the moment the man reached out, his hand closing around Jeremy's arm just above the wrist. Not guiding, holding, fingers tight enough that Jeremy's shoulder tensed immediately. "Come on," the man said. Not loud, controlled, commanding. Jeremy pulled once, instinctive, the movement sharp enough that his heel dragged across the dirt with a dry scrape. He turned his body sideways, trying to twist free. "Let go," Jeremy said, his voice lower now, swallowed by the noise around them. The Ferris wheel creaked overhead as it completed another slow rotation. A car descended. Another rose. Someone laughed nearby. No one stopped. The man tightened his grip and began to move, steering Jeremy away from the Ferris wheel and into the thicker part of the crowd. Jeremy resisted just enough to be noticed, not enough to cause a scene. One witness would later say it looked wrong, that it didn't look like a parent collecting a child, but it also didn't look violent enough to demand attention. Jeremy glanced back once, his eyes sweeping the faces behind him, as if searching for something familiar, someone who would recognize that this was not what it looked like. Then the crowd closed around them. They moved out of sight in seconds. Elsewhere on the fairgrounds, Stay continued her afternoon exactly as planned. She stopped at a booth, counted the coins in her palm, and bought a small item she tucked carefully into her bag. Every so often, she glanced toward the Ferris wheel, using it as her compass, the same way Jeremy had shown her. As the sun began to lower, the heat easing slightly, she headed back to the meeting spot a few minutes early. She stood near the railing beneath the Ferris wheel and waited, her eyes moving automatically from face to face. 5 o'clock came. The Ferris wheel kept turning. Jeremy did not appear. At first, she told herself he was late. He always took longer than he said he would. She stepped to one side, then the other, widening her view. "Jeremy," she called once, her voice thin against the noise. No answer. Minutes passed. Then more. The crowd shifted, some people drifting toward the exits as the afternoon gave way to evening. The smell of popcorn faded, replaced by cooler air and the sharper scent of machinery powering down. "He said 5. Stay whispered, gripping the strap of her bag. She returned to the exact spot where he had pointed earlier, the place he had chosen so confidently. The Ferris wheel began to slow, its metal groaning louder now that the music had softened. Jeremy never came back. As darkness settled over Myrtle Point and the fairgrounds began to empty, no announcement was made. No search was started. No one realized yet that something irreversible had happened. A boy had entered the crowd, and the crowd had absorbed him completely. By the time the lights went out, Jeremy Bright was already gone. Morning came quietly to Myrtle Point, the kind of morning that suggested nothing had gone wrong. The air was cooler than the day before, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and pine. The fairgrounds sat empty now, rides powered down, booths shuttered, the Ferris wheel frozen in place, as if it had simply grown tired and stopped. Whatever had happened there the afternoon before left no visible mark behind. Diane Bright arrived in town expecting nothing more than a routine pickup. She had made the drive with the plan already settled in her mind. Collect Jeremy and stay, load them into the car, head back to Grants Pass. The schedule was clear. Jeremy had called her. They had agreed on Friday. There was no reason to imagine any deviation. When she walked into the house where Jeremy had been staying, the first thing she noticed was the stillness. No movement, no sound of footsteps. Stay was there. Jeremy was not. "Where's your brother?" Diane asked, setting her bag down, already scanning the room. Stay looked up at her, confusion flickering across her face. "He didn't come home," she said. "He said he'd meet me at the Ferris wheel." The words landed slowly. Diane moved through the house, opening doors, calling his name once, then again, her voice rising just enough to betray the edge forming underneath it. "Jeremy?" she called. "Jeremy. I'm here." There was no answer. On a nearby surface, his wallet lay where it had been left. His watch sat beside it. The keys to the apartment in Grants Pass rested untouched, the metal cool against Diane's palm when she picked them up. These were not the things a boy took with him when he left on purpose. These were not the things someone forgot by accident. Diane's breathing tightened. She set the items back down carefully, as if moving them might change what they meant. "He wouldn't go anywhere without these," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. By mid-morning, the realization had solidified into something undeniable. Jeremy was missing. Not late, not distracted. Missing. Diane contacted local authorities. The report was taken seriously at first. 14 years old, last seen at the Coos County Fair. Family expecting him home. Officers began asking questions, their notebooks filling with details that felt ordinary on the surface but carried weight beneath them. "What was he wearing?" one officer asked. Diane answered without hesitation. "A black windbreaker, red tank top, blue shorts, black Nike shoes, red laces." They wrote it down. "Anyone see him leave?" "No." "Any problems at home?" "No." "Any reason he'd run?" "No." Well, the answers stacked up neatly, each one narrowing the possibilities instead of opening them. Word spread quickly in a town this small. People who had been at the fair the day before began replaying their own afternoons, scanning their memories for anything that stood out. Some came forward on their own. Others were tracked down by officers moving methodically through lists and leads. Several witnesses mentioned seeing Jeremy near the Ferris wheel earlier in the day. A few hesitated before adding the part that made their voices drop. "He wasn't alone," one said. "There was a man with him," another offered. "It didn't look right," a third admitted, shifting uncomfortably as if unsure whether they should have noticed more at the time. Officers pressed for specifics. What did the man look like? How old was he? What was he wearing? The answers came back uneven, inconsistent, frustratingly vague. No clear face, no clear vehicle, just the repeated insistence that Jeremy appeared to be pulled, not led. Within the first 48 hours, law enforcement initially treated the case as potential foul play. Search efforts began around the fairgrounds and nearby areas, slow and deliberate. Officers walked paths Jeremy might have taken, scanned ditches, checked restrooms and storage areas, their radios crackling softly as they reported back. But the town itself was already moving ahead of the investigation. Rumors formed quickly, passing from one conversation to the next, changing shape as they went. Someone claimed to have seen Jeremy walking away from the fair late that night. Another insisted he had been spotted the next day on the edge of town. By Saturday, reports filtered in suggesting he had been seen alive after the fair, as late as August 16th or 17th. Each sighting carried a flicker of hope and a sharp turn away from the darker possibilities. Detectives began to reassess. If Jeremy had been seen afterward, maybe he hadn't been taken at all. Maybe he had left on his own. Maybe the fair, with its transient workers and traveling rides, had offered an opportunity too tempting to ignore. One officer voiced the idea plainly during a briefing. He could have gone with the carnival. The theory shifted the tone of the investigation almost immediately. The urgency cooled. The assumption of danger softened. Within a week, law enforcement announced publicly that they were no longer treating the case as foul play. Jeremy Bright, they said, may have run away. Diane heard the words and felt them strike like a physical blow. He had plans, she said, standing rigid as officers explained their reasoning. He called me. He was waiting to come home. We understand, one detective replied carefully. But the sightings suggest. They're just sightings, Diane cut in. You don't even know if they were him. The detective didn't argue. He didn't need to. The decision had already been made. As official attention began to drift, other details surfaced, details that didn't fit neatly into the runaway narrative. Cecilia Fish, the sister of Jeremy's friend Johnny, contacted police with something she couldn't shake. The night Jeremy disappeared, she said, she had seen a man stumble into the entryway of her apartment building. His movements were unsteady. His clothes were stained dark, soaked enough to be unmistakable. He was covered in blood, she told officers. Not just a little. Enough that I noticed. The report was taken down, filed. Without a direct connection to Jeremy, it remained just another unsettling moment in a growing collection of them. Searches continued in fits and starts. Tips poured in from anonymous sources, some vague, some alarmingly specific. One suggested Jeremy had overdosed on a drug-laced beer at a party, his body disposed of by those present. Another claimed he had been accidentally shot by local men near the Coquille River, tended to at a remote cabin before dying, then buried in a shallow grave when efforts to save him failed. Police followed the leads. They searched cabins. They walked riverbanks. They dug where they were told to dig. Each time, they found nothing. As the days passed, frustration set in. The lack of evidence pressed down on everyone involved, reshaping expectations and dulling urgency. Jeremy's name remained on reports and forms, but the energy behind it thinned. Diane refused to let it go. She retraced his last known steps herself, walking the fairgrounds long after the rides had been dismantled, standing beneath the Ferris wheel and staring at the place where her son had promised to meet his sister. She talked to anyone who would listen, asked the same questions over and over, her voice steady even when her hands shook. "Did you see him?" she asked. "Did you notice anything strange? Please," she added when people hesitated. "Just tell me what you remember." Some remembered nothing. Some remembered too much, their stories blurring with rumor and repetition. None of it brought Jeremy back. By the end of the first 48 hours, the case had already begun to slip into something harder to fight. Uncertainty. The clear line between what was known and what was assumed had started to fray, and in that space, doubt grew quickly. Jeremy Bright had not returned home. The fair had moved on, and the investigation, already shifting direction, was about to be pulled into a far darker, more tangled stretch. What happened next would bury the truth beneath years of rumor, misdirection, and unanswered questions. Time did not move cleanly after Jeremy Bright disappeared. It stretched, folded back on itself, then dragged forward again, heavy and uneven. In Myrtle Point, the days returned to their familiar rhythm, but something underneath had shifted. People still went to work, stores still opened, kids still rode their bikes down the same streets, yet every conversation seemed to circle the same absence, dipping into it and pulling away again, never staying too long in one place. With law enforcement now publicly leaning toward the idea that Jeremy had run away, the vacuum left behind filled quickly with speculation. Rumors didn't arrive all at once. They seeped in, one by one, each offering a version of events that felt just plausible enough to repeat. One story moved through town quietly at first, passed in lowered voices. Jeremy, someone said, had gone to a party after the fair. Someone else had brought beer. One of the beers, according to the rumor, had been laced with an illegal drug. Jeremy, with his heart condition, hadn't stood a chance. "They didn't mean to," a man told another outside a grocery store, his voice hushed. "It was an accident." "And then what?" the other asked. "They panicked," the first replied. "You know how kids are. They got rid of the body." Police followed the lead. They identified possible locations, questioned people who had attended gatherings that weekend, walked through properties named in anonymous tips. They found no evidence of a party, no witnesses who could place Jeremy there, no trace of a body. The story dissolved under scrutiny, but it didn't disappear. It lingered, reshaped, retold. Another rumor carried more violence. An anonymous tip, funneled through a prison inmate, claimed Jeremy had been shot by a group of local men while swimming at a spot along the Coquille River. According to the account, the shooting had been accidental horseplay, target practice gone wrong. The men had taken Jeremy to a remote cabin, tried to nurse him back to health, and when he died, buried him in a shallow grave nearby. Detectives drove out to the area described. The road narrowed as it cut through trees, the air cooler and damp beneath the canopy. They searched the cabin. They searched the surrounding woods. Shovels broke the surface of the earth where the tipster claimed Jeremy lay. Nothing. The river kept flowing, dark and steady, carrying no answers with it. As these stories circulated, they began to fracture the community. People started looking at one another differently, measuring words, replaying old interactions with new suspicion. Longtime neighbors wondered what others might be hiding. Parents tightened their grip on their children. The fair now reimagined not as a place of harmless fun, but as the moment everything had gone wrong. Amid the noise of speculation, one detail refused to fade. The sighting of a man covered in blood on the night Jeremy disappeared. Cecilia Fish had not forgotten it. She hadn't forgotten the way the man stumbled into the entryway of her apartment building, how the light caught the dark stains on his clothes, how he looked startled to be seen. When she repeated the story to police, her tone remained measured, but her hands moved as she spoke, tracing the memory. "He didn't say anything," she told them. "He just came in like he was trying to get away from something." Officers listened. They asked follow-up questions. Did she recognize him? Could she place the time exactly? Had she seen him again? The answers led nowhere. Without a name or a clear connection to Jeremy, the sighting remained an isolated fact, unsettling but untethered. As months passed, tips continued to arrive from farther away, each one promising movement, each one collapsing under examination. One urged investigators to follow a road to a concrete bridge in western Nebraska. Another claimed Jeremy was alive and working for a circus company in Florida, where traveling carnivals often relocated during the winter. Police tracked the Florida lead down carefully. They found a young man named Jeremy Bright employed by a circus outfit. For a brief moment, hope surged. Then records were checked. Birth dates didn't match. Backgrounds didn't align. He was someone else entirely. A coincidence that left everyone involved quieter than before. Through it all, Diane Bright refused to settle into the version of the story that suggested her son had simply chosen to leave. She spoke to detectives, to reporters, to anyone who would take the time to listen. "He didn't run," she said again and again. "He had plans. He was coming home." Years passed. The case grew colder, not because it was forgotten, but because there was nowhere left to push. Files thickened, notes yellowed, leads repeated themselves. Jeremy's name became something people in Myrtle Point recognized immediately, even if they no longer remembered the details clearly. In 1988, filming crews arrived in town. Cameras and lights disrupted the quiet as production began on a segment for Unsolved Mysteries. Interviews were staged carefully. Old photographs were held up to the lens. The Ferris wheel, long gone, was described again and again as the place everything had fractured. When the episode aired in January 1989, Jeremy's disappearance reached a national audience. Tips flooded in from across the country. Phones rang constantly. For a moment, it felt as though the case had been pulled back into the light. But light, it turned out, did not mean clarity. Each new call brought possibility, and each possibility faded the same way the others had. The questions multiplied. The answers did not. And as the years pressed on, one name quiet at first, then impossible to ignore, began to surface again and again, pulling the case toward a different kind of darkness. The name surfaced the way uncomfortable truths often do, quietly at first, spoken in half-sentences, carried on the edge of conversations that stopped when someone new walked into the room. Terry Lee Steinhoff. For years, it had hovered near the edges of Jeremy Bright's disappearance, never fully stepping into the center, never disappearing either. Steinhoff was not a stranger. He had once babysat Jeremy when the boy was younger, back when Myrtle Point still felt smaller and safer, back when familiarity passed easily for trust. By the time Jeremy vanished, Steinhoff was a young man with his own reputation, someone people recognized, someone they had opinions about, even if they couldn't articulate why. Not long after Unsolved Mysteries aired in January 1989, police charged Steinhoff in the stabbing death of a 32-year-old woman named Patricia Morris. The crime was violent, personal, impossible to ignore. As details emerged, investigators revisited older files, pulling Jeremy's case back off the shelf and laying it open again. Witness statements were reread. One detail, dismissed earlier as uncertain, now took on new weight. According to some accounts, Jeremy had been seen sitting in the passenger seat of a truck owned by Steinhoff on the day he disappeared. The truck itself became an object of focus, its image sharpened in memory only after the fact. Detectives began asking questions that felt overdue. Did you see Jeremy with Terry? Are you sure it was his truck? When did you last see them together? The answers came unevenly. Some people were certain, others weren't sure anymore. Time had softened edges, blurred faces, shifted confidence. Still, the pattern was troubling enough that police considered Steinhoff a potential suspect in Jeremy's disappearance. There was no arrest, no confession, no physical evidence linking him to what happened at the fair. The connection remained circumstantial, a thread that refused to snap but also refused to pull tight enough to follow. Steinhoff went to prison for the murder of Patricia Morris. Inside, the years stacked up, one indistinguishable from the next. Jeremy's case remained unresolved, mentioned occasionally in reports, revisited whenever new information surfaced, then set aside again when it led nowhere. In 2007, Steinhoff died in prison of a heroin overdose. The news traveled fast through Myrtle Point, not because people mourned him, but because of what his death might mean. He took it with him, someone said quietly. If he knew anything, another replied, we'll never know now. With Steinhoff gone, the possibility of direct answers narrowed even further. There would be no interrogation, no chance to confront him with what witnesses claimed to have seen, no opportunity to watch his reaction when Jeremy's name was spoken aloud. The case drifted again, sustained mostly by Diane Bright's refusal to let it fade. By then, she had moved to Florida, but distance didn't weaken her resolve. Each summer, she returned to Myrtle Point, walking familiar roads, checking in with local authorities, reminding anyone who would listen that her son was still missing. In October 2016, another tip arrived, this one pointing investigators to a pond on private property roughly 25 miles from Myrtle Point. The claim was specific enough, urgent enough, that police took it seriously. Equipment was brought in. The water was searched carefully, methodically, the surface broken by ripples as teams worked their way through the murky depths. Diane waited nearby, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the water. When the search ended, nothing had been found. Again, the pattern repeated itself with cruel consistency. A surge of hope, careful effort, and then the quiet, hollow confirmation that the truth had slipped away once more. By this point, the case had outlived most of the certainty that once surrounded it. Investigators could map the rumors, list the theories, trace the names that appeared again and again. What they could not do was explain how a 14-year-old boy disappeared in broad daylight, in the middle of a crowd, and left behind nothing solid enough to hold. Jeremy Bright had not been found. No remains, no definitive suspect, no single explanation that fit all the facts. What remained was absence and the weight of it. And eventually, after years of waiting for answers that never came, Jeremy's family made a decision that felt less like closure and more like surrender to reality. What happened next would mark the end of the search not in truth, but in hope. By the time the family reached the decision, there was no sudden revelation driving it, no final piece of evidence, No late-night phone call that changed everything. There was only time, years of it layered thick with disappointment, false alarms, and long stretches of silence where nothing moved at all. Jeremy Bright had been missing for more than 2 decades, and the world had kept going without him. In August of 2011, Jeremy's family gathered in Myrtle Point and did something they had resisted for years. They held a formal memorial service. The day was quiet, deliberately so. No search teams, no media crews, just people who had known Jeremy at different moments of his short life, standing together with the shared understanding that whatever had happened to him, it was not going to be undone. Photographs were placed where everyone could see them, Jeremy smiling, Jeremy younger, Jeremy caught in moments that still felt intact despite everything that followed. Diane stood near the front, her posture composed, her hands folded tightly together. When she spoke, her voice did not waver. "We don't have answers," she said. "But we know our son didn't just disappear on purpose. He mattered. He still matters." There was no coffin, no remains, just a name, spoken aloud, finally given a place to rest even as the truth remained unburied. From that point forward, the language surrounding Jeremy's case shifted. Law enforcement continued to list him as missing, but within the family, the words changed. Presumed dead, not because they had proof, but because hope, stretched thin for so long, had begun to hurt more than it healed. Still, the case never fully closed. In 2010, an obituary for Jeremy's maternal uncle included a quiet line that stood out to anyone who knew the story. He was preceded in death by, most probably, his oldest nephew, Jeremy Bright, who has been a missing child since August 1986. The phrasing carried the weight of resignation, an acknowledgement that uncertainty had become the family's permanent companion. Over the years, Myrtle Point continued to remember. New generations heard the story secondhand about the boy who vanished at the fair, about the Ferris wheel that kept turning, about how quickly a place of celebration could transform into the site of a lifetime of questions. Parents repeated the story as a warning. Teenagers listened with half interest, half unease, absorbing the idea that safety was never guaranteed, even in familiar spaces. Diane returned to Myrtle Point whenever she could, even after settling in Florida. She walked the same streets, spoke to the same people, checked in with authorities who had little new to offer. Each visit carried the same quiet determination, the same refusal to let Jeremy become just another name in an old file. "He's not forgotten," she would say. "Not by me." As of today, Jeremy Bright's whereabouts remain unknown. No remains have been recovered. No suspect has ever been charged in connection with his disappearance. The theories still exist: abduction, accidental death, deliberate harm followed by concealment, but none rise above the others with enough force to end the debate. The facts stop where they always have. A fairground, a time window, a boy last seen being pulled away by someone whose name no one can give. The Ferris wheel that once marked the center of that afternoon no longer stands. The fair comes and goes each year, rebuilt and dismantled, leaving no permanent trace behind. But the image endures: the empty space beneath where it turned, the promise of 5 o'clock, the silence that followed when that promise was broken. Jeremy Bright was 14 years old when he disappeared. He did not leave a note. He did not take his wallet or his keys. He did not step out of his life cleanly or cleanly exit the world he knew. He vanished in plain sight, and in doing so, exposed how fragile certainty can be. The story ends where it began, not with answers, but with absence. And the question that remains decades later, still unanswered, is the same one his sister faced that evening beneath the Ferris wheel. Where did Jeremy go? What do you think happened to Jeremy Bright? Was he taken, and if so, by whom? Or does the answer lie in a moment that was dismissed too quickly, mistaken for something ordinary? Leave your thoughts. Share the story. Keep his name alive, because unresolved cases don't end, they wait.